David. David.
Dave, are you in the fridge again? Get out of the fridge.
David. What is up, everyone? I am David Wells, and this is the David Wells Experiment. So, Apple recently announced that they would be discontinuing the iPod. It's been about 21 or 22 years, and maybe 11 years for me, or no, 12 years for me. So, I was kind of late to the game when I got an iPod. Um, I, to the best of my knowledge, they came out in about 2001, 2002, and it was a game changer. You could hold 1,000 songs on an iPod. And Microsoft had the Zoom, and I never got to have one, but I've heard some people say that it was superior and it should have taken off more. The Zoom was even built as an iPod killer, but for whatever reason, it didn't, and Apple reigned supreme when it came to MP3 players. So it's kind of odd how the death of the iPod happened. So when the iPod happened, Napster was a huge thing. There was this big controversy about people sharing songs legally and illegally, and artists not getting their money's worth. So the iPod and iTunes kind of filled a need that was there. So I remember I think Napster, I forget if they tried to become a legitimate business or if they just shut down. But anyway, they proved that people wanted to download music and carry it around with them rather than have to lug around a CD or a tape player. So I guess I should go back to that because my earliest experience with a portable music player, it was a Walkman. For those who don't know, a Walkman was you put a cassette in and you listen to music. And for those who don't know what a cassette is, then that just means I'm old, lol. And I remember the last kind of physical media player I had was a CD player in, I think, up to 2006. But anyway, so the way I got an iPod was, it was 2010. I did not own a vehicle at that point. Or did I? Anyway, I was living on my own for the first time, and I went to Walmart, and I needed something to play music. So I go to the electronics section, and I see the iPod Nano. So I see the Nano, and it says, it seemed like an easier thing to play the Nano, to put music on it, than it would be to carry around a giant thing of CDs with me. Plus, it was like 1,000 songs. I mentioned that before. And I'm like, okay, I should go with this. And that was my introduction to non-physical media. And that little iPod Nano wound up getting me through some rough times because in 2011, my car died. And I was without a regular vehicle for like 2 years. And I hated that. And one of the things that got me through it was my little iPod Nano. So it's a really interesting thing, the journey to the iPod Nano, because one of the things, well, not just the iPod Nano, the iPod itself. The iPod was it ushered in sort of Steve Jobs' genius. Or maybe it didn't usher in, but it was a consequence of him coming back to Apple. The big thing that that ushered in Steve Jobs' return in 1997 was the iMac. And I guess you could say the iPod was his follow-up effort. So in 97, he comes back, and it's this big thing. He had been gone from the company for 13 years. Man, I can't believe it's already been 11 years about since his passing. Rest in peace. So anyway, I think about 2 years prior, Apple at the time, which had nothing to do with Steve Jobs, they were looking to improve because their numbers were not doing great, and they needed to step it up and beef up their computers and their operating software. And they looked at Steve Jobs' company next. Steve Jobs, after Apple, he created a company called Next. He also bought Pixar, which none of the movies have ever touched upon, probably due to licensing deals with Disney. Anyway, yeah, it was one of his second companies, and what he did was, at first, he wanted to create a high-end computer for universities. The hardware aspect didn't do so great, but the software did pretty well. So, about 2 years before 97, he gets approached by Apple, and they're like, hey, we want to buy this company. Now, there are people thinking like, well, if they buy the company, are they going to buy Steve Jobs too? And that kind of wound up becoming part of the deal. He wound up taking over, and he changed things a lot. He vastly simplified their what they had to offer. They Apple, believe it or not, had a video game system. He nixed that. And yeah, and other people could make Apple clones. He got rid of that too. And they even had a handheld portable assistant called the Newton. They got rid of that. Now, one of the things that he did was he realized that people were pirating stuff either way, and the quality really wasn't that great. So he sought to make a deal with the record companies and the artists and be like, look, this thing is here to stay. Digital isn't going anywhere. Why don't we make a legal how about we provide a lawful means for people to listen to music digitally? And one of the first people he convinced was Dr. Dre. And Dre said, wow, somebody finally figured it out right. So that was the solution, because at the time, streaming was not yet a thing. You couldn't like listen to simultaneously. That was going to be a couple years down the line. And that's what would eventually lead to the death of the iPod. So anyway, it's really interesting. I should probably make a whole video about Steve Jobs. I'm going to, and yeah, I don't know why, but anyway, I'm going to have to save some stuff for it. But anyway, so it was this big thing, and the iMac proved that Steve Jobs, it kind of proved him right in his sort of craziness that like got him fired in the first place, because Apple wasn't doing so great. But at the same time, he had to kind of go off and do his own thing, be able to do exactly what he wanted. And, he learned some humility. But anyway, he got to come back and be the artist he was always supposed to be. So the iMac was a huge success. And he followed that up with the iPod. And there was a huge marketing thing. And it dominated the MP3 players because they made it look cool. Now, 2002, what's interesting is they began plans for the iPad way before the iPhone. There are mock-up designs for a very bulky looking iPad, but instead they decide to focus more on an iPhone instead. And we got those in 2007, and we all know how that went. Now, one of the things about the iPhone was it served a similar function to the iPod. And that's probably one of the things that led to the death of the iPod. Or its obsolescence. I don't know how to use that word. I shouldn't have said it this early in the morning. Anyway, it made it seem like superfluous to own an iPod when your phone could do the same stuff. So anyway, so the iPhone comes along, and that's a game changer. And a couple years down the line, there's more competitors. And one of the things that it introduces, at that point, the internet became powerful enough that you could stream music. And people went to services like Spotify and YouTube to listen to stuff. And people didn't. One of the interesting things is the iPod kind of led to people not buying CDs. So it almost seemed. So one of the things that streaming did was it made it where, do you really want to go through the process of looking for music, downloading it, and having to do that all the time when you just have to hit a couple keys and you've got your artist? Now, I will say there's a benefit to that method. Sometimes you're not always able to find the music you want. So, in a streaming site, that's one reason why I stuck with the iPod for a while. Now, that's less and less the case. So, this kind of began at, the death of Steve Jobs, when streaming sort of started to blossom when he passed away. So, and it's really interesting is that physical media has kind of made a resurgence. And it's being billed as, okay, MP3s, they're a lower quality file format, but they're there for ease and convenience. Whereas analog, it sounds better. It's a bit bulkier and pricier, but you get the experience of owning physical media. And it goes from cassettes to CDs to records, especially records. Records became a big thing, ironically, around the same time that streaming did. So there were these two options, which basically made downloading seem silly and unnecessary. The interesting thing is, though, most streaming platforms, they do offer some sort of download option. So if, say, you're going to go without Wi-Fi for a second, although that seems like silly nowadays, but in the rare circumstance that you would be without it, you've at least got your music or your show or whatever with you. So in a way, it sort of lives on, but a device so specific just for that and not being a phone, it seems unnecessary. So I guess they decided to discontinue it because the iPhone serves pretty much the same purpose. In a way, it's kind of surprising that they lasted as long as they did. But anyway, yeah, we don't have an iPod anymore, and, rest in peace, I suppose. It was a product of its era, and, that era has passed. Well, this has been an interesting episode of the David Wells Experiment. It's given me reason to think about doing a Steve Jobs specific episode. Have an absolutely super day, and we'll see you next time. Bye.